So today we are continuing our exploration of reason during the month of September. And I wanted to take a look, in that vein, at one of UUism's prominent theologies that we draw from, and that is the theology known as humanism. It is the belief system that undergirds so much of what we are as Unitarian Universalists. It lifts up science, reason, and the human potential to solve human problems without waiting for any kind of divine intervention. But this time I wanted to take a new angle on humanism, and that angle is the intersection between humanism and racial justice. So my words today are based on the work of Anthony Pinn, P-I-N-N. His book is called Colorblindness Isn't the Answer: Humanism and the Challenge of Race. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this author, Anthony Pinn. He's the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religion at Rice University, so he's local, relatively speaking. He is the first African-American full professor to hold an endowed chair at Rice. He is also Director of Research for the Institute for Human Studies, which is a think tank in Washington. He is a former board member of the American Humanist Association and is a member of their Speakers Bureau. He is the author-editor of over 30 books, including numerous volumes related to African American humanism, of which he is the preeminent scholar. He is also the editor of 4 book series, including Studies in Humanist Thought and Praxis. Some of his book titles are The End of God Talk, an African-American Humanist Theology, and Writing God's Obituary: How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist. So I first became aware of Anthony Pinn because he taught a summer course at my seminary. Sadly, I was not able to fit the course into my schedule, but you could imagine being at a Unitarian Universalist seminary would be a relatively welcoming place for an ardent humanist scholar. You can learn from Anthony Pinn's bio that he is African American. You can also tell that he is a real insider within the humanist establishment at its highest levels. Simply by reading his book titles, you can see that he is unapologetically and hardcore non-theist. But in the book I'm going to focus on today, he really provides his answer regarding the disconnect between humanist philosophy and humanism in action, especially as it pertains to racial justice. I think all of Anthony Pinn's advice to humanists really applies to Unitarian Universalists, whether you happen to be a humanist UU or not. I believe part of Pinn's motivation to write this book was frustration regarding questions he is often asked by white humanists. Questions like, why aren't there more racial minorities within humanist circles? How do we get more racial minorities in humanist circles? Let's first take a look at the traditional priorities of humanist organizations. Unsurprisingly, humanists prioritize the separation of church and state. They prioritize education based in science, particularly the natural and physical sciences, more so than the social sciences. They oppose the influence of religion on public policy. That has been another huge priority. But that's a pretty narrow focus for a theology that is intended to lift up humanity. And there's a leaning, a tendency within humanism that isn't helpful when it comes to issues of race and racism. Humanists really shy away from issues that science can't readily fix or cannot be addressed through logic and reason alone. There is practically nothing more completely illogical than racism, right? It broke the mold in terms of being illogical. Race is an unscientific, made-up construct, but yet it's real. It is a huge part of our social and cultural reality and our existing power structures. People are affected by bias they cannot even recognize because racism is so deeply embedded into the consciousness and the unconsciousness of our society. And unfortunately, even those with the greatest reasoning and logical abilities cannot think themselves out of the bad racial programming we get by growing up in this society. At least, the caveat here, at least without making a real effort to learn and to change. So humanists, they're not immune, more immune than anybody else. They can be racially uninformed, they can be racially insensitive, and they can even be racist. Anthony Pinn writes, I am one who has argued for a few decades now that humanism should address issues of social injustice, like racism, as part of its commitment to the well-being of life in general and human flourishing in particular. To omit attention to modes of social injustice like racism is to reduce the connotations of the human in humanism. I think what he's saying here is that how can we be uplifting of all humanity when we don't address such basic fundamentals that are oppressing human and limiting humanity and limiting human potential, things like racism. Yet before humanists get busy to work on racism, some groundwork has to take place. Some learning has to happen. A question Anthony Pinn often gets is, why does the Black community continue to embrace religious traditions like Christianity that have been used to do them harm? You may have had this question yourself, right? Why would someone still embrace the religion of the slaveholder, under which the Bible was used to justify enslavement and inferiority? And even more so from the humanist point of view, why do you still believe that God will save you when such horrible things have been done to your people? Well, Anthony Pinn says there's a context, there's a history, a cultural context we have to learn about to understand this before you should really go there with those kinds of questions. You know, go to school first. And that he says that humanists really need a more developed and a more nuanced understanding of how and why racial minorities participate in Christianity and other theist traditions. It turns out that many racial minorities remain at least loosely associated with theistic religions like Christianity because it still, despite its shortcomings, it still meets a lot of needs. Now, there may be disturbing and even damaging theology in the mix, but there is also supportive community in a society that is often unsupportive. The church is a safe place to be and to talk about real life and how it really is. It's not necessarily the theology that is keeping racial minorities in the churches. It's the sense of refuge, the sense of belonging and shared identity. It's a cultural home. It's about social connections and business networks. It might be about political power and activism. It's the place to go to be built up in the face of a society that can so willingly and easily tear you down. So humanists who argue with racial minority Christians about the irrationality of supernatural belief systems are totally missing the point. The reasons for being in church are not necessarily theological. So if humanism wants to appeal to wider demographics, it has to consider its ability to meet some of those same secular needs that are being met in church communities. It's also necessary for us to widen our understanding of the Black religious experience in America. It's not monolithically Christian. It is so much more diverse and complex than you might think. At least 5% of enslaved Africans brought to the Americans were Muslim, Islam that was passed along for generations in some situations. West African indigenous religion also influenced the African American religious experience, and emergent religions like the Nation of Islam are still present today. Many African Americans also practiced traditional Sunni Islam at racially integrated mosques. What white humanists can do is exactly what any white ally is told to do when working for racial justice. Be content with the supporting role. You do not, period, get to be in charge. You don't get to set the measurements of success. Yield to the wisdom of those who are most affected by the injustice. They know more about their situation than you do. There is also a mythology in humanist circles that seems that humanism is a new, unfamiliar concept to racial minorities. That's simply not true. There is a scary bias that humanism is for intelligent and reasonable people, while your people, and that's whatever non-white group that may be, tend to be more emotional. Well, that statement there, that's a belief that plays on an age-old racist ideas that non-white people are intellectually inferior and childlike in handling their emotions. And humanism is not a closed system in which racial minorities must be ushered in. Anthony Pinn says humanism is an open philosophy of life, and its organizational structure is at least theoretically open to all who embrace particular definitions of humanism. Many peoples, many, have been doing humanism for a long time. They might not be calling it humanism, but they've been doing humanism independent of any particular relationship with the white humanist establishment. The history of humanism in racial minority communities is actually long and deep, but very much unknown, or not paid attention to. Humanistic ideas can be found in blues music. Blues, not like spirituals, which are, God-centered. Blues, what is it about? It's about the struggles of real life topics centered in the here and now, in the physical world, daily life, with no real call for supernatural assistance. Blues songs, they offer lessons, right? Life lessons and morals. They talk about that horrible thing I did and how that was so bad and I won't do that again. Again, with no God involved. And the blues songs, they emphasize the humanity of the people of African descent who are experiencing the struggles of life and death. Same goes for African American folk tales. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass expressed humanistic beliefs. He did not believe in waiting around for supernatural assistance. In the early 20th century, countless African Americans embraced Marxism or socialism, showing that theistic belief among African Americans was never monolithic. The poet Langston Hughes was in this camp. Most recently, if you've read the book or listened to the book, Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I highly recommend, his perspective draws from very humanist sensibilities. If you're willing to look for them, you'll also find humanist threads interwoven throughout the Latinx and Native American traditions in U.S. history. When it comes to why racial minorities are not participating in humanist groups in great numbers, Anthony Pinn says there is an assumption that racial minorities are missing out on opportunities, are ignoring important connections. But are they? That's the end quote. Humanist organizations need to lose the idea that humanism in minority communities is a new thing, when these communities have been practicing it in their own communities for centuries. While humanists who are wondering why there is not much minority participation in their groups are also asking why there is not as much minority participation in their groups, Anthony Pinn is also advocating, again, anti-racist training in general, advocates that white people get educated on white privilege. I've talked about white privilege before. White privilege has nothing to do with how much wealth you do or do not have. Instead, it's about the positive assumptions you automatically get as a white person, the positive assumptions, how the world sees you. And that's automatically granted to white people without having to earn it at all. Now, this is a huge topic in and of itself. It's one that I've preached about before, but so I'm just going to summarize every other sermon I've done on this. It's up to every white person, if you haven't been exposed to formal education or workshops, to Google for resources, read books, and learn about white privilege and white supremacy culture. And that's just for a start. By doing this, you can begin to learn that the white experience in America is different in shocking ways from the non-white experience. If you do this, you will get uncomfortable. Then you will get angry that you are missing out on this important piece of reality. Then you will feel guilt, but the guilt is not the point. It is totally not useful. So get over the guilt and focus on this important piece of reality you have just learned. You will feel empathy and maybe be motivated to do something about the devastating things you have found out about. You will start seeing the acts of blatant discrimination and the little tiny microaggressions, the biased remarks of others, and you will most likely feel the need to stop tolerating them. You will begin to challenge oppressive systems. Because, from the humanist perspective, it's all about maximizing the well-being of all. Pinn's advice to humanist groups is to make undoing white privilege central to the group's mission, and then go ahead and walk the talk. He says when you invite minorities in, it's not about telling them how wonderful and anti-racist you are. It's about listening to how white supremacy hurts people. White people getting really uncomfortable usually shows that the process is working. There are also some common pitfalls in language to avoid. Don't ever talk about everyone being oppressed. That's like saying all lives matter instead of Black Lives Matter. If you are white, straight, cisgender, have no disabilities, and are not impoverished, yes, you may have problems, big problems, but oppression is not one of those problems. Circling back to the title of the book, let's also consider the misinformed idea of colorblindness. Our story today gave a great example of what the limitations of colorblindness. A lot of us, including myself, I think it's a generational thing, we're taught colorblindness as kids. That everyone is the same, that race doesn't matter. So somehow it's just better to pretend that everyone is white. Well, there's a problem with pretending that everybody is white, because that just enforces this sick idea that white is better, right? But difference is not to be ignored. It's not a problem to be ignored. It's not a problem to solve, because difference is not a problem at all. Difference is an opportunity. Difference helps us all become better. So Anthony Pinn says tackling white supremacy must become a central marker of humanism's identity and purpose. It is a little mind-boggling that humanists who just hoover up every bit of information they can find, they have so much intellectual curiosity, they want to be informed, they want to be well-read on important issues, but yet racial justice is not one of these topics they always hoover up. Why don't some of the smartest people, the most avid knowledge seekers, feel like being racially informed is a priority, is an imperative? Anthony Pinn says humanists should show the same commitment to knowing something about race that they show concerning separation of church and state, evolution, and other issues that mark the bulk of humanist publications and conference programs. There's obviously a narrow comfort zone that does need to be expanded within the humanist community. But now I'm going to get to the fun part, what I see as the fun part. This is the fun part of the book. Anthony Pinn believes that humanists have a lot to learn from hip-hop culture. Now, he goes out of his way to say, despite some of its negatives like misogyny and homophobia, which he totally doesn't endorse, but he says humanists can learn from certain things from hip-hop. He says that humanism and hip-hop music culture share a human-centered and earthly sense of what the human is. Hip-hop culture has been around for decades now. It is not a fad. It has actually gone global. It has gone beyond the African American community. There are people doing hip-hop in countries all over the world. Both hip-hop and humanism are totally countercultural in many ways. Yet hip-hop caught on like wildfire. Humanism, maybe not so much. But hip-hop is all about the lived, everyday experience of people. What does humanism have to say about the everyday life of regular people? How can humanism help people with their everyday life and problems? What does it have to say to them about that? Hip-hop lyrics embrace the reality of human struggle and tragedy, just like the blues. Humanism remains defiantly optimistic in its reliance on science and reason to fix everything. How can humanism address the fact that life is struggle and tragedy as well? So this big call for humanism to address racial justice is a strong one, particularly because humanism claims to exist to advance the greater good of humanity. Let's put some more humans back in humanism. As a postscript, I'll tell you that 2 years after the publication of Anthony Pinn's book, the American Humanist Association passed a board resolution against white supremacy. This resolution was very global, covered the whole country, the world, but part of the really global resolution was the Humanist Association's affirming its dedication to stamping out white supremacy and racism from within its organization through hiring practices, resource allocation, staff and board training, and more. The resolution also speaks against the idea of colorblindness. I think Anthony Pinn probably had some hand in that. Now, I have no idea how much has really changed since this resolution. It looks, according to the pictures of their board members on the website, it looks like they're, doing a good job towards diversity, but they've at least, made this claim. It's a start. As I mentioned earlier, I believe a lot of what Anthony Pinn has to say to humanists is just as appropriate for Unitarian Universalists, no matter your theology of choice. We share many of the same values, and honestly, we share a very similar demographic. And we need to continue thinking about what we have to offer to diverse communities. And then we must deliver. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.